wet nurse, a black enslaved woman to care for their children. After the war, his wife passed away, but the wet nurse stayed with the family and raised the children into adulthood. My aunt used this story to argue that slavery in the South was a mutually decent arrangement, saying our family only survived because of the care of a black woman they supposedly saw as a second mother. I wince every time I think about that conversation. It wasn't just the story, but the way my aunt told it, completely blind to the privilege and power dynamics she was describing. That conversation opened my eyes to the deep undercurrent of racism and mythology in American family histories. While painful to confront, I'm grateful to see the truth more clearly now. Story 27. This might seem silly, but my family kept it a secret for years, particularly from the younger generation, and I didn't even find out the full story until after my great-uncle passed away. My grandfather's brother, Uncle Dan as we called him, was both gay and a huge pothead. I know it doesn't sound like a big deal now, but back in the day, my family treated it as a huge scandal. Uncle Dan was an amazing guy. He loved cars, even worked for an auto manufacturer, baseball, and gardening, both the regular kind and the fun kind. He would help us with car troubles, buy the family tickets to minor league baseball games, and give us zoo season passes every Christmas. He was always kind, loved the kids in the family, and even helped take care of them. He had been married for a few years and had one son, but the marriage didn't work out, for obvious reasons. Once his son was grown, Uncle Dan moved in with his mom, my great-grandmother, to care for her when she became too old to live alone. They lived together for years until she passed at 89. Tragically, Uncle Dan died from cancer just 3 months later. I found out about his pothead side as a teenager, but we never smoked together, unfortunately. After he passed, my mom finally told me he was gay. It made me sad to realize that he couldn't fully live as himself while he was alive. Even though my family never treated him badly, they still made him feel like he had to hide who he was. I wish I had known while he was still here so I could have told him that I loved and accepted him for who he was. But life doesn't always work that way. Wherever he is, I hope Uncle Dan is living his best life in a weed garden, happy and free. Story 28. My brother and I always suspected our dad wasn't our biological father. Our parents brushed it off, and by our late teens, we let it go. Over 20 years later, I got a friend request from a woman in Texas. At the time, I was a small YouTube craft personality, so I figured she followed my tutorials and accepted her request. The next day, she messaged me and explained that her stepfather was my biological father, and my brother's too. Her story checked out, and when I saw a picture of him, I knew she was telling the truth. For a year and a half, I didn't tell anyone in my family. I couldn't look my parents or relatives in the eye because it turned out they all knew and had kept it a secret. It turns out my mom was briefly married to this man, divorcing him a year after I was born. She met my dad, or possibly reconnected with him, married him 6 months later, and he raised us. When I finally decided to tell my family, I planned a trip to meet my biological father and went to my parents' house for dinner to break the news. My dad reacted angrily, saying I had stabbed my mom in the back. I expected the reaction and didn't take it personally. My mom convinced me to cancel the trip and rebook it with my brother, which I did. Unfortunately, my brother didn't take the news well and lashed out, accusing me of betraying him by keeping it a secret. A few years later, he took his own life. He had struggled with insecurity and anger, and I still feel guilty for how things unfolded. It's been over 10 years and I still haven't met my biological father. Maybe one day. Story 29. Thanks to an ancestry DNA test, I discovered I almost dated my half-brother. Growing up, my parents were very social and often hosted parties. One of their friend groups included a southern rock band whose kids we grew up with. When I was 16, one of the older boys, John Smith, caught my eye. He was 19 and very handsome. After my boyfriend cheated on me, I asked John to take me to a school dance to make my ex jealous. My mom was hesitant, saying John was too old, smoked, and was a bad influence. But we went anyway. Nothing romantic happened. It felt more like going with a childhood friend. Fast forward to Christmas 2019. My husband bought me a DNA test. When the results came back, none of my dad's family members showed up. Instead, I saw a list of Smiths, including one listed as a half-sibling. It turned out my mom had cheated on my dad with members of the band, one of whom was my biological father. My aunt confirmed it, saying my parents had both struggled with infidelity and drug problems when they were younger. I was furious. My mom passed away when I was 18, and I grew up feeling unloved by my dad. No one thought to tell me the truth. I've since learned I have 6 additional siblings on my biological father's side. Ironically, I attended my biological father's funeral a year before this revelation, out of respect for John Smith, who remains a close friend. Looking back, I'm so grateful nothing happened romantically with John. It could have been a nightmare. And as for my family, let's just say I have no patience for secrets anymore. Story 30. When I was in high school, my mom, dad, and younger brother visited my mom's family at our vacation condo a few hours away. I couldn't go because I had to work my summer job, and I was pretty bummed about it. Apparently, one night, an argument broke out between my mom and her younger sister. My aunt was a surprise baby, born while my mom was in college, and grew up during a time when my grandparents' investments had finally paid off. This meant my aunt had a more privileged and comfortable childhood than my mom, which led to a lot of resentment. The fight started over something mundane, like cleaning up after dinner, but escalated quickly. My aunt called my mom a fat, jealous bitch, to which my mom replied, "I may be fat, but I'm not jealous. I'm not the one who was messing around with Grandpa's business partner." Turns out my aunt had an affair with one of my grandfather's close business partners. My mom even babysat for her one night when my aunt went to meet him. After that explosive revelation, I got a call from my brother saying they were heading home early. The fallout was terrible. Most of our extended family sided with my aunt and turned on my mom. To this day, it blows my mind that I missed all that drama. Story 31. In the early 1980s, my family abandoned my aunt when she was just 20 years old. She had a severe mental disability, and they sent her to a state-run mental institution in the South, where no one ever visited her until she passed away last year. It was similar to the story of the Kennedys, but sadly more recent. She couldn't speak well and had limited language skills, but could recognize and acknowledge people. Despite this, my relatives never checked on her, and I can only imagine the conditions she endured without anyone advocating for her. I only learned about her when she passed and asked an older aunt for more details. The most ironic part: my family has always donated to and supported charities for intellectual and developmental disabilities. It became clear that their involvement was more for appearances than genuine care. Story 32. I grew up without a father, as did my 4 siblings. My younger brother had a different dad who was never around, and the man I thought was my dad lived down the street. He would drive by with his new wife or girlfriend, and I would wave excitedly, telling my friends, "There goes my dad," without understanding why he never stopped. At 23, I heard a rumor from my aunt that my real dad was looking for me. I brushed it off, thinking she was just trying to cause drama. Years later, at 37, I got home from work, grabbed a beer, and told my wife I needed some alone time. Then the phone rang, and the caller ID showed the name of the man my aunt had mentioned years ago. I froze. My wife answered and told me it was my dad. I took the call, and he spoke quickly, likely afraid I'd hang up. He told me he'd been looking for me since I was 23, but had stopped after someone told him I didn't want anything to do with him. No one knew who gave him that misinformation, but it stole years from us. Eventually, I confirmed with my mom and siblings that he was my real dad, and no one denied it. The man I thought was my father was not. Everyone had kept this secret from me my entire life. Thankfully, I spent 9 wonderful years building a relationship with my dad before COVID took him in January. While I regret the years we lost, I'm grateful for the time we had. Story 33. A few years ago, my mom, who was obsessed with researching our family tree, bought 23andMe kits for me and my fiancé as Christmas gifts. When I got my results, a name popped up that I didn't recognize. We shared a significant amount of DNA, so I showed it to my mom, but she didn't recognize the name either. Since I was no longer in contact with my dad at the time, I reached out to the woman directly. After days of back and forth, we found a name we both recognized: my grandmother. It turned out that my grandmother had an affair with this woman's father a month before he married her mother. The woman was my biological aunt and lived just a few hours away. This revelation made so much of my childhood make sense. My grandmother had always been particularly cruel to me, even though I was the only one in my generation who avoided trouble and achieved success. Looking back, I realize it was likely because I reminded her of her infidelity. As for my fiancé, his 23andMe test helped him reconnect with his biological mother, father, and brother, which was a positive and healing experience for him. Story 34. After reading through similar stories, I've realized that those dramatic soap operas on TV aren't as far-fetched as they seem. Sometimes the truth really is stranger than fiction. When I was 16, I started piecing together the truth about where my life began. I had seen a framed picture of my parents' marriage certificate and did the math. It didn't add up. As I grew older, I noticed my mom was extremely strict with me. She didn't allow me to go out unsupervised, be around boys, or stay out after dark. While my parents were strict with all of us, it was particularly intense with me. One day, standing in my bedroom doorway, I confronted my mom. I pointed out that she was pregnant when she married my dad and said something along the lines of, "That's why you hate me so much." The look on her face was one of utter shock. She hadn't expected me to uncover the family secret, and in that moment, she didn't know what to say. Looking back, it explained so much. My mom had always treated me differently than my siblings. She was hard on me, often rejecting me, and never told me she loved me. She acted as if I owed her something, and if anyone else showed me kindness, she would get jealous. Any small ray of happiness I found was quickly taken away. Despite getting good grades, staying out of trouble, and taking care of my siblings and the household, I felt I could never earn her love. That lack of love led to emotional struggles and eating disorders during my teenage years. I didn't know what a healthy family dynamic looked like, and anytime I spoke up about the dysfunction in our home, I was silenced through abuse. At 15, my parents began to separate, and I was sent to live with my maternal grandmother. It turned out to be a blessing. For the first time, I experienced unconditional love and acceptance. My grandmother treated me like I mattered, and her care provided a foundation for me to rebuild myself as I grew older. Later, I learned the full story. My mom had been a teenager in the 1960s when she went out with my dad. On one date, he parked at Griffith Park in Los Angeles. My mom, who was very inexperienced, claimed she felt pressured into intimacy that night. She became pregnant, which caused a massive uproar in her family. Her mother, ashamed and embarrassed, threw her out of the house. My mom, only 17, had to move in with my dad's family, who also weren't thrilled with the situation. The resentment from this experience stayed with her, and she never sought therapy to heal. Years later, my parents' marriage was strained. My dad had his own issues, likely neurological or developmental, which made him struggle with boundaries and appropriateness. His behavior caused scandals and even more pain for the family. He is now in his 5th marriage, trying to settle down in his later years. My mom, on the other hand, has mellowed out somewhat and acknowledges some of her mistakes, though much damage remains. Ironically, a best-selling teen novel written by someone who knew my brother in grade school is partially based on the trauma of our childhood. My brother, who is my closest sibling, has faced more trauma than most people I know. Yet he carries that into his own family despite being a wonderful, kind person. He's sober now, but his children still deal with the effects of growing up in a home affected by addiction. Through all of this, I've learned an important lesson. While it's easy to blame the bad guy in our stories, the real challenge is to break the cycle. Healing and restoration are what truly matter. Story 35. When I was in 7th grade, I had to do a report on my ancestry and needed to look at my mom's birth certificate. I noticed her maiden name was different from what I expected and asked her about it. She made me promise not to tell my grandfather because it would break his heart. It turns out my mom's biological father had proposed to my grandmother, but she turned him down due to her struggles with addiction and mental health. My grandfather met my mom when she was just a little girl and decided to marry my grandmother to give her stability and a father figure. In 2011, when my mom was in a coma, dying of cancer, my grandfather broke down and told me with tears in his eyes that he married my grandmother because my mom needed a dad. It was the only time he ever mentioned that he wasn't her biological father. After he passed in 2020, it came up in conversation, and neither of my mom's sisters had ever known. Despite everything, my grandfather was the one who took care of my mom throughout her life. When she passed, the responsibility fell to me as her sisters wouldn't be bothered. I gladly took care of him because he was more of a father to me than my biological dad ever was. He taught me what real love looks like. Story 36. My dad once told me that I was supposed to have a younger brother, but my mom miscarried when I was 2 years old, and my sister was 4. My mom never wanted us to find out. 2 years later, they had another daughter, but my mom apparently wanted to take the miscarriage secret to her grave. I only found out recently when my dad visited my daughter for the first time. My parents divorced 20 years ago, and my dad wasn't able to visit because of his late wife's health issues. After she passed, he could finally come see us, and he shared this secret with me. My mom still doesn't know that I know, and my 2 sisters have no idea. I also learned another family secret during this visit. My great-grandfather was murdered while working on the railroads in Chicago during the Great Depression. The police refused to investigate because my family were immigrants. We'll never know who did it, only that someone targeted him for his relative wealth and background. Story 37. While my grandfather was fighting in the war, my grandmother had a secret relationship with a Chinese man. She became pregnant with him between the births of my dad and aunt. She somehow hid her pregnancy from everyone, including her family. When she went into labor, she drove herself 6 hours to the nearest city and gave birth in secret. The baby was born with minor disabilities, and my grandmother left her at the hospital, where she was eventually adopted by a wealthy family. When the child was 50, she reached out to my grandmother, but my grandmother denied everything and acted shocked. After my grandmother passed away 2 years ago, the truth came out through birth certificates and documents. My dad and aunt were stunned to learn they had a half-sister they never knew about. Story 38. My brother, who's adopted, decided to search for his biological family after having kids. He wanted to know about his genetic health history. He discovered a letter from his biological parents saying they loved him, but weren't ready for kids at the time as they were in college. It turns out his biological parents stayed together, got married, and had 3 more children, making them his full siblings. He met his biological dad for coffee, but his dad asked him not to contact them again, saying his wife had a hard time with the adoption decision and would be distraught if they reconnected. It broke my brother's heart, especially because his siblings don't know about him, and he has so much in common with his biological family, shared interests in sports, education, and even appearance. It's painful knowing he can't build a relationship with them, but he treasures the small connection he did make. Story 39. After being injured by a blast in combat, I developed a seizure disorder. Despite no family history of seizures, doctors asked me to investigate my genetic background. I had cut ties with my abusive birth family years ago, especially after my severely autistic sister died due to a suspicious overdose. No investigation was done because of her disability, and my last tie to my birth family was severed. Through 23andMe and Ancestry.com, I discovered that I had many connections to my birth mother's maiden name, but none to my birth father's last name. I reached out to an aunt who spilled the truth. My birth grandfather was sterile. My grandmother had an affair with a neighbor's husband to conceive my father. The truth caused a massive scandal back then, as the neighbor's children looked strikingly similar to my father. The families moved away, but I later met one of the neighbor's sons who confirmed the story. Tragically, shortly after we connected, he took his own life, leaving me without further answers about my genetic history. This experience left me questioning how many of us really know the full truth about our ancestry. Story 40. My uncle wasn't a good person in the conventional sense, but he loved me and my cousins more than anything. He was a heroin addict, and we often smoked pot together. At one point, when he was homeless, he built a home by welding 3 single-room campers and a school bus together. He installed a wood-burning stove to keep warm during the cold Ohio winters. My aunt, who was his ex-wife and also my guardian at the time, allowed me to stay with him for a few nights when I was 15. My uncle had a pig living outside in a pen, and he dug a pit to roast it. One evening, while we were playing cards, an older man, Kenny, stopped by. Kenny gave me an uneasy, predatory vibe. Over the next few days, Kenny came over frequently. We played cards, smoked, and hung out, but something always felt off. One night, while I was chopping wood outside, Kenny told me he loved hanging out with me. The way he said it made me feel deeply uncomfortable. A few nights later, I woke up to find the fire in the stove had gone out. I went to the shed for more wood and thought I saw a man in the woods. I told my uncle, but when he checked, he found no one. One evening, while my uncle was in town, Kenny showed up uninvited. He helped me chop wood, but his gaze made me uneasy. When we went inside, Kenny tried to take advantage of me. Just then, my uncle came home, saw what was happening, and dragged Kenny outside. I sat in the corner, crying, while I heard yelling and fighting. Hours later, my uncle came back inside, covered in dirt, and told me I wouldn't have to worry about Kenny ever again. Story 41. My grandpa always bragged about putting his son through college, which my dad resented. My dad had worked his way through school with ROTC and Eagle Scout scholarships, plus a janitor job at his fraternity house for room and board. 40 years later, at my cousin's wedding reception, my great-aunt mentioned that a woman named LaTroya had passed away. When one of the cousins asked why she called her that, she explained it meant the whore in Italian. Long story short, this woman had been my grandfather's teenage sweetheart. Her father wouldn't let her marry my grandpa because he was a middle school dropout, so she married a well-educated mobster instead. Years later, her mobster husband, who was infertile, was mysteriously shot. The woman moved back to town living with her parents, and a few months later she had a baby boy. My grandfather always worked 2 full-time jobs and flipped houses on weekends, yet he didn't leave much when he died. Curious, I Googled the widow's son, whose name I found in her obituary. He had attended the University of Michigan and law school, achieving great success. I'm pretty sure I figured out which son my grandpa actually put through college. Story 42. Growing up, we all thought my grandmother, Gram, was just mean. She constantly complained about her stepmother and half-sister, which we dismissed as exaggeration. Years after she passed away, my mom found a stack of letters and a cassette tape while packing to move. These revealed the truth about how cruel Gram's stepmother and half-sister had been. After Gram's mother died, her father remarried and essentially left her in the care of her stepmother, who sent Gram to a Catholic orphanage for schooling. She rarely saw her father. When Gram's husband, my grandfather, left to fight in WW2, her stepmother and half-sister sent her a "with deepest sympathy" card. On the back, there was a cruel letter calling her worthless trash and saying she should accept her life was over. When her half-sister got married, she sent Gram an invitation, but included a handwritten note saying she wasn't allowed to attend. The real reason for the invitation was to make their father believe Gram was ungrateful for not sending a gift. The cassette revealed more manipulation. Gram had recorded a conversation in which her half-sister lied to their elderly father, claiming Gram had confused him into sitting outside in the cold for hours. After their father's death, the stepmother and half-sister contested his will, claiming Gram had been a terrible daughter and convinced a lawyer to expunge it. Gram lost about $500,000 in inheritance. This newfound information made us realize Gram wasn't exaggerating. She truly endured a lifetime of mistreatment from her own family. Story 44. This is a difficult story, and I'm still processing it to this day. My first niece, who was older than me in our Asian family dynamic, this isn't unusual, tragically took her life in 2017. She had been battling CPTSD, severe depression, and schizophrenia. After her passing, my older siblings finally revealed the truth about what she had endured. When she was younger, some older cousins had abused her. She carried this secret for most of her life. Prior to learning this, I had no idea why our extended family had grown apart, as we had always been very close. During times when my niece was struggling, my family often took her in. It was during one of these stays that she confided in my siblings about her trauma. This happened around the rise of the #Me Too movement, and I later learned that my sister was also a victim of the same group of cousins. There are likely more victims who have not yet come forward. Before her passing, my niece confronted her abusers at a family gathering. They denied everything, dismissing her and calling her crazy. When my sister came forward, she faced the same response. These denials caused my niece to distance herself from our extended family, which deepened her isolation and worsened her mental health. I believe this played a role in the development of her schizophrenia and her eventual decision to take her own life. What makes it even harder is that she had been making progress. She started taking medication, exercising, had a job, and even found a boyfriend. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, she ended her life. Her funeral was heartbreakingly silent. Many of us felt that the abusers bore some responsibility for her death, but they refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing. Since then, my family has cut ties with that side of the family. The revelation has disrupted our entire family dynamic. My parents rarely see her siblings because of what their children did to my parents' daughter. This loss wasn't just about my niece, it also felt like the loss of our larger family. I've noticed my mom's depression has worsened over the years, and the grieving process has been long and difficult for all of us. I was never supposed to know the full story, as I was still a child when it happened. But the day she passed, emotions spilled over, and the truth came out. It shattered my idea of what family meant. Before this, I believed family was everything. Summers and holidays were spent with our larger family, but that doesn't happen anymore. As I've grown older, I've noticed that our circle has become much smaller. The families of the abusers have chosen to side with their relatives, claiming none of it ever happened. However, I know for a fact that one of them apologized to my niece before her death. He had a daughter of his own and felt immense guilt. Surprisingly, my niece accepted his apology, facilitated by my sister and her husband, who were close to him. But when his siblings found out, they ridiculed our family for letting the secret out because they had sworn to keep it hidden. The fallout was messy, and it still is. I don't think they'll ever forgive us for speaking the truth because they care more about protecting their image than facing the consequences. This tension has even affected the younger generation. Although we aren't responsible for what happened, there's an awkwardness between us. Our parents don't encourage us to spend time together because of their disdain for one another's families, even though we grew up as close cousins. My sister continues to deal with her trauma and has been diagnosed with CPTSD. It's been incredibly difficult for her, and watching her struggle has been heartbreaking. I'm not sure where this post is going, but I needed to let these emotions out. The grief, the loss, and the fractured family, it's all still so hard to process. Story 45. A few years ago, I decided to try Ancestry.com and managed to trace my family tree back to Louis Hebert, the first European apothecary to arrive in Acadia with Samuel Champlain. When I shared this with my grandmother, she surprised me by admitting that half of our family tree might not even be accurate. She explained that her mother, my great-grandmother, had been ostracized by the family. She was kicked out or ran away at 16 after alleging she had been assaulted. She never shared much detail about it. My great-grandparents married just days before my grandmother was born. However, my great-grandmother's birth certificate wasn't recorded until 1936, 2 years after my grandmother's birth. We pieced together that my great-grandmother's birth likely caused her own mother's death, which happened within the same month. This led her father to resent her. Alternatively, she may have been the product of an affair, compounding her father's anger. He remarried, and her stepmother treated her poorly. Around age 17, she experienced another assault. Shortly after, she married a man she was dating at the time, and they went on to have 13 children together. Because of the gaps and coincidences in the timeline, there's a strong chance that my great-grandfather, and even my great-great-grandfather, aren't biologically related to us. This throws the supposed distinguished lineage into question. Looking back, there are so many oddities in the family tree. It's made me question just how much of it is rooted in fact. Story 46. My great-uncle's story was one of shame and silence in my family. He was killed by neighbors during the epuration post-WW2 purges at just 17 years old. My grandmother rarely spoke of him. It was too painful. All we knew was that he had been labeled a collaborator who worked with a local group aiding the Gestapo. The family instead celebrated his brother, who was a war hero. Last year, my father decided to investigate the truth. What we uncovered changed everything. At 15, my great-uncle joined the collaborator group out of ignorance and youthful naivety. However, he quickly realized he had made a terrible mistake. He approached a resistance group from another region, asking to join their fight against the Nazis. The resistance agreed to take him in, but asked him to remain in the collaborator group as a spy. For nearly 2 years, he provided intelligence to the resistance, even helping Gestapo prisoners, fellow resistance members, and Jewish individuals escape. When the war ended, the epuration began, a chaotic time when accusations of collaboration were often based on little to no evidence. It was also an opportunity for some to settle personal vendettas. My great-uncle's neighbors accused him of being a collaborator and refused to believe his claims that he had been spying for the resistance. They didn't investigate or contact the resistance group to verify his story. Instead, they locked him in a barn, tortured him for 3 days, and then killed him, burying his body in the woods. We found a photo of my grandmother, her sister, and their mother at the makeshift grave, crying. An investigator also uncovered a letter my great-uncle wrote to his mother shortly before his death. In the letter, he explained that he had a very quick trial and would be executed that day. He repeatedly apologized for the pain his death would cause her and asked her to be kind to the barn owner, who wasn't involved. His handwriting became shakier and more panicked as the letter went on. My great-grandmother never saw the letter. She passed away before it was found. Although my grandmother still owns the house in that village, she never visits. The memories are too painful, and she harbors deep resentment toward the neighbors, many of whom are still alive. Due to a law passed by Charles de Gaulle, all post-war violence during the purges was pardoned, meaning the neighbors could never be held accountable. With the documents proving my great-uncle's role in the resistance, my grandmother finally moved his portrait from a small, hidden room to a place of honor in the living room.